Began last week, and the first week of this series was about I will be a functioning member, a functioning church member. It means I will be involved. We talked a lot about how the local church, and if it works as it's supposed to work, I reminded you of what my friend Bill Hybel says, that it is the greatest, there's nothing like it when it works. It's the hope of the world, and when it works well. Well, it doesn't always work well. And so what we've talked about is the functioning part, and today we talk about the unifying part. Chapter 2 is I will be a unifying member. Jesus was pretty clear about this. I mean, he was a no-doubter. I mean, he talked often about, by all this, you will know that you are my disciples by a simple but profoundly difficult thing, and that is that you will love one another. The premise of the chapter here is clear, and that is that we will become Christians that God expects. No, the writer even says God demands that we be unifiers. And I wonder how that would impact. Go around today, of the people that you know, I regularly hear about even our members who have chosen, through the years that something had happened to them and they're disgruntled. I had one last week that a friend of mine told me about and gave no reason, but he just said, I don't really want to come to church anymore. Paul has a lot to say about that. We have been studying Ephesians before we just started James now on Wednesday nights, but early on in Ephesians, we find out Ephesians is a church that Paul really likes. It's one of his favorite churches, and he says, this is why, since I heard about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all the saints, I never stop giving thanks for you as I remember you in my prayers. Notice the phrase, your love for all the saints. So, now we're going to slide forward. We're in chapter 4 of Ephesians, and if you've got your folder, you want to follow along, look at the scripture for today. Paul says, as a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received, to be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep your unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now, I took some time to try to put some words together that would kind of divide this chapter, and as you might think, we preachers think in alliteration. So I've lined up some points here, and the first one is the audacity of accord. That means being connected together in a way that, in fact, allows us to refuse to be divisive forces. While I was on vacation, I ran across a TED Talk. How many of you are familiar with TED Talks? They're really short, little TED Talks, 12, 15 minutes. You go to their website, you'll see any topic covered, basically. And they take what they consider to be the experts in certain fields, and they ask them to give a TED Talk. And so it can be, this organization started in 1984, so there are a few TED Talks out there. But this one was a fairly new one, and it kind of struck me. It was given by a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I don't know who in the world would name their child Lord, but maybe that's a part of his rabbi. And you're going to see a picture of him there. If you've ever imagined what a rabbi looks like, doesn't he look like one? Anyway, I was really amazed at this guy. I mean, he said some very, very powerful things. So our deep dive this morning is going to be just kind of unraveling some of the things that he said. He began his talk by a Thomas Paine quote. It said, these are the times that try men's soul. Anybody doubt that? I don't doubt that at all. He talks about how that we've just gone through very divisive elections and that we have a divided society and the growth of what he considers to be extremism, religiously, politically. He says it's just all over the map. And so what he's trying to do is figure out how we can bring ourselves together. Matter of fact, the title of his talk was, how can we face the future without fear, together? Well, he goes through what I would consider to be very important analysis. And he begins by saying, what is it that we worship? And so he says, if you go to the anthropologists, the anthropologists of the people, I think I'd probably be one of those if I wasn't a pastor, because what they basically do, anthropologists take history and they look back through time and look at cultural beliefs, and they just figure people out. They figure out why we are the way we are. And so The anthropologists, when they look back at our generation, what will they see and what will they hold on to? And how will they answer the question, what do we worship? Well, his belief is that our culture will be characterized by the selfie. Now, I am one that will tell you that I just took a selfie with my wife the other day. So not all selfies are bad. I mean, some of them are really good. But I think what he's trying to say is that we are somewhat obsessed with the culture of ourselves and how we communicate through social media. And he goes on a little bit. I'm not going to go too deep in what he says, but he really thinks that we have to rediscover, and he has a 50-cent word, a 50-cent phrase. He says we need to rediscover the choreography of altruism. Now, let me unpack that. Choreography means a dance. It means we need to understand the dance of loving others and serving others. That's what he's saying. He's saying let's rediscover the dance of loving each other and serving each other, because he says that's where we will unlock this tension that we feel. So we've got to learn to trust each other. If you were a part of the Unlock the Block last night that was going on around here, it was, as I told you, there were all kinds of bohemians out there. I mean, there were just people drinking brew and just flying around. I mean, it was a great place to be. I mean, it really was. And I had me and my grandkids right in the middle of it. We had a blast till we got blasted with the rain, but it was a fun place to be. It's something about being with people who are not just like you. I know, we are really good at tuning it in. Let me give you the three things he hits, and I won't go much deeper this. The future of us, he says, can be discovered in three dimensions, the us of relationships. And what he's saying is, we've got to understand that the relationship is more important than our differences. That the relationship is more important than our differences. And he's of the belief that if you live according to Google filters and Facebook friends, you know how you can do that, don't you? Hey, I don't like them. Boom, I knock them off my list. Just like that. I can unfriend you. Ding. Boy, that felt good. No, it didn't. What we do is narrowcasting, not broadcasting. We listen only to what we want to listen to. We've shut everything else off because we're convinced we're right. Therefore, and I'm convinced he's right when he says, the less people we know who disagree with us, the worse off we are. And I think he's right. The rabbi concludes this. He says, every time we hold out the hand of friendship to someone not like us, or whose class or creed or color are different than us, we heal one of the fractures in this world of ours. That's the us of relationships. Secondly, the us of identity. He says something I had never heard. He says, have you been to Washington? Because there's the Lincoln Memorial. And if you go there, you'll see the Gettysburg Address on one side, the second inaugural address on the other. He says you go to the Jefferson Memorial and you'll see all kinds of texts all over. You go to the Martin Luther King Memorial, you'll see all kinds of text written out. He says, if you go to London in Parliament Square, you'll see a monument to David Lloyd George. And guess how many words they have written about him? David Lloyd George, that's it. You also see a statue of Nelson Mandela. You know how many words he has? 2. Nelson Mandela. And if you go and look at Churchill, he has what? 1 word, Churchill. And so what he's saying is we have to make sure, not only as a nation, but as a faith community, to make sure that we know that we have stories to tell and to keep telling those stories. And that we feel different from people because we don't feel like they know our story. Have you ever stood in the line at a store and the people behind the counter didn't speak a word of English, and by the time you got up there, you wanted to take your milk carton and hit them in the head? Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that in church. Maybe I only felt that way. Because you want them to, I want to tell you our story. And I know the difficulties. I'm not trying to over-dramatize that, but we have to be careful. We are a nation of immigrants. I just encourage you, go and look at that little talk. He ends up with what he calls the us of responsibility. And he says the most important American phrase we have is we the people. And he believes that is because it says that we all share collective responsibility for our collective future, and we have to do this thing together. So, let's move on to number 2, the taming of the tongue. Now, most all of us had this one down. We don't have any problems with this one, so I'll just take a brief few moments. Yeah, that's right. I hope somebody's laughing, because this is a monumental issue, and particularly around churches. Rainer speaks against this gossip issue by quoting a long passage from Romans 1, where it lists all the bad things that people are involved in. And right in the middle of that list, he says there are gossips. No matter how you define gossip, idle talk, rumors, unproven stuff, James has a very distinct word for it. He says the tongue is like a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body. It sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and itself set on fire by hell. So what does Rainer say? He says we first of all have to decide not to be the source. In other words, put a filter on what you say and try to say, okay, I'm just sharing this out of a prayer concern. How many times have I seen that? I mean, it's confidential, but I want to share this as a prayer concern. When in reality, you just can't wait to tell it. Put a filter on and try to understand, why do I need to say this? Does it bring value to me? Secondly, decide not to be the receiver. The receiver. Now that's more difficult, really, because you got to kind of prompt people. I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable talking about that. Can we shift that gear? I've even gone so far as to say, have you talked to the other person that you're talking about here about that? Because maybe it's something we need to go and talk to them about it. That'll stop a conversation just like that. And thirdly, and most importantly, the fuel of forgiveness. I could talk for weeks about forgiveness. I'm just going to tell you one book, the best book in all of history about forgiveness, is Lewis Smedes' book, The Art of Forgiveness. It's by far the best book you will ever read if you need to deal with forgiveness. And I would tell you that forgiveness is almost always the central part of what it means to have spiritual growth. Think of a time in your life when you grew spiritually, and I'll guarantee you that forgiveness was some part of that. When I knew that the Wainwrights were going to be with us today, and I knew I was going to be talking about this theme, I began remembering that story. I told this to you probably 5 years ago. Obviously, some of you were not there because some of the folks have been asking me about what I have sitting up here. I was pastor at Central Baptist Church in Winchester, and I had a long week, and I was excited about it. I was getting ready to spend it with some of my buddies from down the road in Louisville. I trained 3 or 4 of these guys in karate for a number of years while I was a seminary student. And every so often, I'd drive down on a Friday, we'd work out and spend the night and talk about male bonding stuff, And so we'd hang out together and just kind of have a good time. Then I'd come back up and be normal again. But I don't know what was wrong with me. I've known I'm mechanically dysfunctional for a long, long time, but there was something about me that felt like a real man could change his own oil. And so I got me one of those little contraptions. You've seen them? You put them on there and you tighten it up and you just put it. That's easy. The only hard part's getting underneath the car. And I wasn't about to actually jack it up. That takes too much time. So I got underneath my Honda Accord and put that thing on there, changed the oil. I was like a man when I got done with that. I flexed my muscles and said, yeah, man, change oil. I got down the road a little ways, and sure enough, this light came on the dash of my car. And I remember, I've told you, my brother used to call any light on your dash an idiot light. My brother was the only mechanic in our family. So I pulled off the side of the road and I said, idiot, I'm going to look at this light. And so I popped my hood open. And I knew a lot about what was under that hood. And I popped that hood open and looked down there. I didn't see anything wrong. Looked fine to me. Note to self. If oil is leaking out of your car, it doesn't leak up. Note to self, it leaks down. You will not see it from the top. Car's still running. I got places to be. Get back in my car. How long do you think it lasted? A minute and a half. Car stops, pull off the side of the road, call wrecker, get it pulling into my garage. By then I'm thinking, I bet you my oil had something to do with that. Guy from the garage calls me, says, Dan, you're going to need a new engine. That was not what I wanted to hear. So I left. I got another car, all that kind of stuff. I came back on Saturday, and all of a sudden I found out within the next week that a bunch of guys from Central Baptist Church got together, got my car towed from the garage, and they began working on my car. And I don't know how they got this newer engine. I mean, we paid a little bit for it, but it was almost, I think it had 20,000 something miles on it. They found this engine. And I think there were, you remember the words when Jesus sent out somebody to get the donkey that he says, Jesus has need of it? I think they went to this person and said, Jesus has need of this engine, and so we'd like you to give it to us for very cheap. They didn't tell them it was me, but nevertheless, they put that engine in my car. And they presented this in front of the church to me. This is the burned piston that was in my car. And up here on the plaque, it says, they gathered themselves together with one accord. Now, I would love to tell you that we lived happily ever after. But what I want to tell you is that unity is hard. The main guy that led that charge to do that, his wife got upset with me about something, and they ended up leaving the church either right before I left or right after I left. I asked Dennis about them before I came. I says, have they ever come back to the church? No. They're running another church now. I say all that to say, at some point, we've got to understand it's not about us. It's not about us. The music is not about us. It's not about us. It's about loving each other in all of our differences, turning this church over to the next generation in good form, and believing that God will, in fact, do his good work in